Vale.
Thank you, Acting Speaker, and great to see a fellow member of the North again in the chair. Look, I'd like to begin by my contribution by actually just starting to call out some of the absolutely ludicrous claims that the Liberal opposition have been making in relation to this bill. And I say this from the context of the fact that any policy we've ever put up in this chamber, or indeed outside the chamber, when it comes to housing, has always been opposed by the Liberals. They've been the first to say no when it comes to any policy or measure we've sought to introduce to try and increase, provide incentives and encourage the construction or increased supply of housing for families, for renters, retirees and people in need. Because, you know, whether it was the Plan for Victoria, they opposed it. Whether it's our housing statement, they've opposed it. Whether it's our goal and our target, ambitious as it is over the next 10 years to build 800,000 new homes, they oppose that target. They oppose the construction of more granny flats in people's backyards. What have they got against granny flats? They oppose the $5 billion big housing build program. They oppose our rollout of 12,000 new social and community homes through the Big Build housing project. And now, of course, we come to today where they oppose this short stay levy bill as one of the means and levers to try and free up and create more housing opportunities. They oppose every measure, every step of the way when it comes to building and unlocking that supply for housing. And forget about the three-word slogan of stop the boats. Under this Liberal opposition, frankly, it's stop the homes. But I'd like to also take this opportunity to just also call out again some of the misleading allegations that are being made in relation to this bill's alleged impact on the tourism sector, particularly from the Shadow Minister for Tourism, the member for Nepean. God help us if he were to become the Minister for Tourism. And I say this from the context of having been a former tourism advisor to the former minister, and who I believe was the greatest tourism minister, with no disrespect to the current minister, the greatest minister for tourism, John Aaron. I had the pleasure to serve with John Aaron. I knew John Aaron. John Aaron is a friend, and I can tell you the member for Nepean is no John Aaron. And because you've got to look at not just what he doesn't say, because he doesn't say much really. I mean, what new events, what new policy measures have the opposition announced when it comes to growing tourism since they've come to opposition again for another occasion post-22 election? They haven't announced anything except for criticise and oppose again everything we've been seeking to do when it comes to tourism. And the stats and the facts which the opposition don't want to cite just speak for themselves, because frankly the way the Shadow Minister, the member for Nepean, talks about tourism in this state, he should be the Shadow Minister, he should be the Minister for Tourism for New South Wales or Queensland or South Australia, because he talks down the tourism sector in a way that actually encourages the other states to want to try and poach our events and our tourism sector. Because the fact is, our tourism sector, year on year spend, let's look at the facts, are well over now $39 billion in total visitor spend, growing by $1.5 billion in the last quarter alone. That's a 12% year on year increase when it comes to total tourism spend in this state. It's growing substantially. Total tourism spend now compared to 2019 pre-pandemic is 31% higher than prior to the pandemic. Total visitors have reached 98% levels compared to those of 2019. International visitor spending has reached over $7.8 billion, an 86% increase year on year for the state's economy since then. Total domestic tourism expenditure in Melbourne has now recorded at 27% higher than 2019. And let's look at the regions, region by region, where a lot of these allegations are being made around how this bill is going to impact those respective regions. Let's look at how those respective regions have been growing on the watch of this government and this great current tourism minister, Minister Dimopoulos. Looking at comparing to pre-2020 levels, the Grampians, for example, their domestic visitor expenditure has grown by 50%. It's grown by 93% in the Geelong and the Ballerine region. It's grown by 91% in the Phillip Island region. And I acknowledge the member for Hastings who's here and the member for Bass as well. In the High Country, it's grown by 52%. And the Great Ocean Road, we just heard the member earlier from that region, where tourism expenditure domestically has grown by 58%. And there's all this talk about tourists being driven away from the Great Ocean Road and the 12 Apostles. Well, the last time I checked, the 12 Apostles aren't going anywhere. They're still going to be there for tourists to go and see. In the Murray region, I see we may have a member from that region coming up shortly. I've had the pleasure to spend time in his region, in motel and caravan park accommodation recently this year. The tourism expenditure in Bright, the Murray region tourism expenditure has grown by 35%. The Goldfields, 61%. Mornington Peninsula, where the member for Nepean comes from, 54% growth in domestic tourism expenditure. You don't hear him talk up his local tourism sector at all. In Gippsland, 53%, Yarra Valley, Dandenong Regions, 82%, Dalesford and Macedon Ranges, 24% growth. In total, regional Victoria's domestic tourism expenditure is recorded at 39% higher than in 2019. Because when it comes to tourism, we've been proudly continuing to build a calendar of events that are the envy of all the other states and territories across the country. They're doing their utmost to poach many of these events, but they've got no chance because, again, on the watch of previous Minister Pakula and current Minister Demopoulos, we've, for example, secured the Australian Open until 2046, another 22 years that the Australian Open and Grand Slam is still going to be here. The Australian Grand Prix has been secured till 2037, another 33 years. The AFL Grand Final staying until 2057, another 34 years. The Boxing Day Test, as we heard earlier today in question time, staying until at least 2030, another 6 years. We've had the Melbourne Cup and Spring Racing people in the building just recently this week. We're investing in the Geelong Convention Centre. Cardinia Park master plan has been virtually completed. We've got the Western Bulldogs in Ballarat going out to Eureka Stadium. And we continue to invest across many of our other regions in terms of events, the Regional Events Fund, marketing and promotion, all proudly led by Visit Victoria and the respective good work of the regional tourism bodies and authorities as well. And of course, this policy, just before I turn to the substance of it, is just as important when it comes to the workers of the tourism sector. Again, when I was tourism advisor, I remember sitting down with many operators over those years and hearing many of their different grievances and concerns in relation to the industry, which we sought to support. But one of those big concerns was the lack of housing for tourism workers in the regions in particular. And I just find it absolutely ironic that this is a bill, one of the measures that will actually try and free up some of those properties that are currently locked out of that rental market and actually have that opportunity for workers to be attracted to those regions to work and to find rental properties which they currently are locked out of. And so this bill will, to some degree, support those outcomes. And of course, this short stay levy bill will introduce that 7.5% levy on short stay bookings in the context of, namely, housing, creating more housing consistent with the policies that we've already committed to as a government, whether it's the Plan Victoria statement that we're developing and consulting on at the moment, the housing statement, the 800,000 new homes target, the big housing build, and the rental reforms, 130 reforms of which we've introduced to make renting fairer for people who rent. Because really, Acting Speaker, alongside one's health, nothing is more important than housing and finding a home to live in, whether it's families, young people, students, workers, retirees, or whether it's people experiencing housing stress, rental stress or homelessness. Every Victorian does deserve the chance to live in an affordable, accessible and safe place. But as we know right now across Australia, that's becoming harder than ever before. Housing affordability has been at its lowest in decades and is taking that much longer, for example, for first home buyers to save a deposit than it used to. And vacancy rates for rentals are at record lows and prospective tenants are finding it harder and harder amongst the dozens and dozens of applications they're competing against to access a property. And doing nothing is simply not an option, hence why I've cited all those different measures we've been undertaking, the context of which this bill is one of those important levers. And which is why we need to progress with this bill as a matter of priority. It's a bill that will help instil, and I refer members to the contribution for the member for Tarneit a bit earlier around better balancing and helping create a fairer housing market, particularly for workers, essential workers, and particularly for those looking to live out in the regions, and indeed even in my own community of Marybeck too, where many of the essential workers, whether they be nurses, emergency services workers, fewer and fewer live in my community because of the housing affordability issue, and very low vacancy rates, record low vacancy rates. And again, this bill, and I acknowledge the work of my council, Merri-bek Council in this respect, which has been advocating on this issue, and which provision appropriately has been made in this bill for local government to also play a role going forward, and I commend the bill.